Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda. Good to see you.
Gerald is a fellow of the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. We are focused in this series on the analysis of reasoning going deeper. And in this particular session, we're focused on inferences. And before we begin, let me just tell you that today is Friday, May the 20th, 2022. So we are going to explore the concept of inferences. And for those of you familiar with our work, you'll know that inferences represent one of the elements of reasoning, one of the 8 elements of reasoning. And we're going to burrow into that conception today. I'd like to turn it over to you, Gerald, to introduce us to the concept of inferences.
Okay, well, good. Glad to do it. So there's a lot I could say about inferences, and we're going to be discussing aspects of it. So I can say that historically, in the classical accounts of reasoning by inferred from Socrates, but in Plato and in Aristotle and all through the Middle Ages, all the way up to nearly the present, reasoning was centered on inferences. There's a sense in which inferences lie, the concept of inference lies at the heart of reasoning. And the old conception, the classical conception, I don't mean old as in outmoded, I mean old as in classical conception, is that you start from something, you start from information or assumptions, and then you reason your way to a conclusion. That act of reasoning your way toward the conclusion is making an inference, it's inferring something. There's a sense in which the words inference and conclusion are synonymous. And there's another way in which they're a little bit different. The word inference is actually ambiguous. It's got 2 different senses. One is that it's the conclusion you draw. So I'm making the inference to such and such. It's the conclusion that you draw. So inference in that way represents the statement that you're drawing out of the information plus assumption. But there's another meaning of the word inference in that the inference is not what you arrive at, but it's the going from the information and the assumption to the conclusion. That is, inference can mean making an inference or drawing a conclusion. So the classic conception of reasoning is that you start with something and you see what follows logically, what makes sense the way it follows. And when that follows, that's your inference, or that's a good inference. It's a sound or valid inference. Based on your information and assumptions. But there's a variety of inference that we list as among the elements of reasoning in that wedge devoted to inferences that I want to say a little bit about. And that's interpretation. So whenever we interpret something, we're making an inference, we're drawing a conclusion. So if I interpret your behavior, I notice what your behavior is, and I come to a conclusion about it. That's what an interpretation is. So interpretation is an intrinsically important part of inference, and it's not usually mentioned very much in the classical account of reasoning. But notice that you're making inferences all the time in your life. You're making inferences about about going through traffic, about friends you meet, all those interpretations in your life. How to live your life better, how to live your life at all. You're making inferences, what to have for dinner. You're constantly making inferences. That's not to say that we're always making good inferences. It's not to say that we're always making inferences that are clear or accurate or relevant to the issue at hand, but we're always making inferences. And that actually brings up another kind of ambiguity about inferences in relation to the standards of critical thinking. I just mentioned 3, clear, accurate, and relevant. And there are other standards, of course. But many times, people talk about inferences as if there's something we need to teach our students. We need to teach our students to make inferences. And I work with ACT, the testing corporation a few times, and they had a big section on teaching students to make inferences. And I know what they mean when they say that, but that's not what they mean. We're making inferences all the time. All your students make inferences all the time. There's not, when they say, your class was terrible, your class was terrible, that's an inference, right? They observed your class, they drew the conclusion that it was terrible, it's an inference. What we want to teach students is not to make inferences, but to make inferences that meet the standards of critical thinking, meet the criteria. Clarity, accuracy, relevance, with as much precision as is needed, as deep as is necessary, and so forth. So that's a general account of influence.
Well, there are many facets in what you just said. And so let's burrow into some of those. I'd like to just, if I could, articulate the way I understand inferences. So to me, inferences are at the heart of how we make sense of the world. And so we are continually making inferences. And that means, when I say continually, I mean, and linguistically. So we are thinking thoughts more or less continually as we're awake, and we're making inferences about what is happening in the world. Just I'm trying to think of another word for continually other than routinely, but it's like it's always happening. It's happening so much. It's like the air we breathe. It's like the concepts we use that we have no awareness of. So that, for example, every time you say something, I have to make sense of what you said. And actually, I wrote a number of notes as you were talking in different directions. And that shows some of my inference making. Right. If a teacher were to take this up right now, she would see that I was with you, I was paying attention, and I was trying to make some reasonable moves based on what you have said. All of these are inferences in context. So we can't, as with all of our reasoning, we can't get away from inferences, and but they're usually happening at the unconscious level. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have to do lots of things at the unconscious level. I mean, we have to assume that I'm assuming that this building is not going to fall down upon me while I'm talking to you. So I have to be able to take certain things for granted, or I could never even live. And that's how people go through things like post-traumatic stress, because right there, they can't assume things that they should be able to assume about their safety, for example. So to me, inferences are very important in terms of our teaching and learning critical thinking. And I do think that everyone should learn the term inference and use it explicitly.
I do too.
And as you say, we have examples of being able to teach this at the elementary level. So let me give an example of that in relationship to, well, one of the things that I think is important, you talked about the inference making as both the, as it were, conclusion as a form of inference, and also the process that leads you from this is true, or this is what I see, therefore that is true. It's a step of the mind. It's another analogy for this process. And the importance of that, one of the things that's so important about it is that when we make a step with this particular analogy, if I make an inference, if it's a step of my mind, it's a decision that I make. It's an active decision, if you will. A step is active. So I've made I've taken this step, And what is crucial to understand is that whenever I take that step, I might have taken a different step. I might have moved in a different direction. So somebody is, so these are some examples I've used with young children. So I give them this format to complete these sentences. So here is the situation. You come downstairs in the middle of the night and you look next door to the house next door and you see what appears to be a flashlight moving around in the house. What do you infer? And you can do this with very young children who really can't even write or read. And they'll all their hands go up and they say, there's a thief, there's a burglar. Or, you know, they'll say something, right? And then they may say 3 different things, or a lot of them will say that. And then you say, okay, that may be true. And this is also part of what they write out. But so you might infer X, but instead you could have inferred Y.
Right.
And this is a skill set that each of us must have if we're going to advance as critical thinkers. Because if I can't see that I made a move and I could have made a different one, and that would have been better than the one I made, if I can't improve in that process, then I'm going to have difficulty advancing as a thinker. So it is this process that I'm wanting to understand, and I'm wanting my students to understand. And then I also want to, for example, you brought in now interpretation as one form of inference making. So if I'm thinking at a high level of skill, when I say I mean anyone, but just using this term I, so if I'm thinking at a high level of skill, then I can listen to a person talk to me who's reasoning at a high level of skill, and I can understand that person. But if I am not thinking at a high level of skill, and this person is, this person's thinking is actually better than my thinking. Maybe they just have been around longer and learned more, and they've put their mind into things that I haven't put my mind into as much. And so I'm listening, and if I'm thinking at a high level of skill, it doesn't mean I have their same level of knowledge, but it means that I have the critical thinking abilities.
Indeed, yes.
To hear what they're saying, and to, in certain cases, leave behind maybe a whole lifetime of nonsense that I've been believing. So that's also a very important part of inference making. In other words, take the opposite. So you have someone who cannot hear a good argument, cannot be moved by reason, which of course is related to confidence in reason. So this inference making, these interpretations that we make, must be made, again, as you say, adhering to intellectual standards.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned about how inferences are often unconscious. I mean, our unconscious life is filled with inferences, and our conscious life can be as well. But your example with the small children was you look over there and you see what appears to be a flashlight moving over, and what do you infer? What inference can you draw from that? What do you infer? And I would say, in accord with what you were saying, even saying what appears to be a flashlight, you're already making an inference that the light you see is brought about by a flashlight. And you actually made that prominent in what you said, because you said it appears to be a flashlight, draws our attention to the fact that it's an inference. But even if you hadn't said that, you said, there's somebody, I see a flashlight over there. Notice that by itself is an inference you've made, because what you see is a light moving around and you infer that it's caused by a flashlight. So, so very interesting how not necessarily deep it goes, but how thoroughgoing it is, the inferences. It brings up another point that I actually hadn't intended to talk about the classical account of reasoning as being centered on inference, but I want to say that the ubiquity of inferences, the fact that we're always making inferences all the time, means that there's something I would say almost seductive and dangerous about overemphasizing inferences in this way. Formal logic, I'm not a fan of formal logic at all, for many reasons. But formal logic was built on inferences. So it built the whole thing on inferences. So you had premises, which would be information or an assumption, and a conclusion based on that. And that seemed fine to people for centuries and centuries. But notice that there's no place in it. Notice how different it is from using the elements of reasoning, because there's no place in that classical account for what's your purpose in doing this whole thing? What's your purpose in making that inference? Or the one you just mentioned, thinking, how would Gerald look at it? How would Richard look at it? There was no account of looking at it from a different person's point of view with intellectual empathy. Many of the moves that we standardly make using the elements of reasoning and that we make in our lives are not captured by that argumentation model. Information and assumption leading to a conclusion. Yeah, there's something tempting about that.
No, I am glad that you began with a little bit of the history of the concept, because this, and that you're following up with these further comments, because, and of course, my knowledge is limited in terms of traditional philosophy, but the idea that you can boil reasoning down to premises and conclusions. And of course, as you said, in premises, we have information and or assumptions. And so we actually do have, in this case, I'm sorry, information and assumptions. So we actually do have three of the elements. But if you want to be generous.
Right. But even that, Linda, is our reading in our, I would say, deeper understanding, because when I learned logic, there was no distinction between information and assumptions. There were premises. And we would say some of those premises might be assumptions, some of them might be information, but no one ever said anything like that. So it was so even those two elements were not brought forward as part of reasoning. We treated all premises as assumptions on the way to the conclusion.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And I remember, for me, it was very confusing, because Richard, when I was starting to really learn the elements and going and really beginning to get better command of them, he was then trying to teach me the traditional approach. And I kept saying, well, why would you want to be teaching me that? Because that's obviously not, I mean, this is rich and full. Let's stay over here. Why are we going back to that? Why do I need to? That was just so confusing. And because I would say, well, why would they do that? Whenever, obviously, right? Because I'm introduced to this rich concept, and you that's sort of the way you think backwards. So so why would I need to study that now when we've advanced beyond that for the purpose of understanding reasoning? And
I would say that knowing what was there before lets you appreciate the richness of, say, the elements and the standards together. Because if you're just presented with this as here's a very good way to reason, and you do the elements and the standards and you put it forward, many times people will say, oh yeah, I see, I get that. I would see why you emphasize purpose and point of view. So it's just kind of more matter of fact, not when you look into it deeply. But if you know that past,
yes,
makes
it's so true. I was thinking that exact thing, that this is one of the reasons why I think critical thinking is so difficult for people to learn, because the tools, as they've been developed through these decades in our approach, are now handed to you, the reader, on a silver platter.
Mhm.
So you don't have to work through it. You don't have to figure out why purpose is one of the elements of reasoning. You don't have to figure out why questions are at the heart of it. And you don't have to figure out if there are any other elements of reasoning.
Right.
Because that's already been dealt with in some way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
And so the person, this was one thing that was very interesting about working with Richard. He rarely used the elements of reasoning and intellectual standards terms in daily discourse.
Mhm.
They were always moving in the back, in the front, and around his mind. They were always there. So he was using them, but he wasn't necessarily stating
Right.
this purpose, this question, this. So that is what we've all got to achieve if we're going to be having, if we're going to have this advanced toolbox of critical thinking in our minds. And that means we can't just say, oh yeah, purpose, question, information, inferences. Yeah, sure. Okay, got that. What else do you have? Oh, well, we've already been through a workshop where we talked about that. We want to talk about something else now. Okay, we have the elements, we got the standards, we got the traits. Oh, how about if we come into your life and study your life for a day? Then you tell us you've got the element, standards, and the traits, right? Because nobody does. Nobody does is fully commanding the use of these throughout every moment of their lives. So so this movement in history from an era, really, let's say up until the 1960s or so, this traditional model that we've been talking about, and from philosophy, was just assumed as reasoning. And by the way, this again is one of the main parts of the critique of Richard Paul's dissertation in 1965. So then maybe I don't have the date right, but in the 60s. And so it laid the groundwork for the work that we're doing now, because in that dissertation he says, look, the way we're thinking about reasoning is not helpful. We can't do anything with this. You've got logicians narrow thinking of logic in a very narrow way, when actually in real life it's used in this very broad way. What do we do about that? How do we know even how to analyze thinking, and how do we know how to assess thinking? We're hopeless. We don't have it figured out. We've got all these technical terms we're supposed to be applying to everyday life, and it just doesn't work. So this is something that all of us need to be very aware of, that we can't just give lip service to this. We can't just say, yeah, I got it. That's a violin. Sounds beautiful. Now you play it. So then some other things that I want to just mention, and this is something we've already talked about, but basically just to highlight it. So the way that I see us living a human life is that we're continually inference making. We're inference making creatures. And if inferences are steps of the mind, then if we make this move, we realize we could make a different one. This has all kinds of implications for our, for example, mental well-being, our mental health. So if you're making inferences that are getting you into trouble, or if you're making inferences that are keeping you in a bad relationship, then those need to be questioned.
Right.
So for example, well, he doesn't treat me that well, but it could be worse. Right. That's an inference. And but it could be worse is probably being highlighted in the mind.
Right.
That keeps you in the fear mode.
Right.
I can't do any better. That's an inference.
Right.
I can't do anything to make my situation better. That's an inference.
Right.
I don't have any options.
Mhm.
That's an inference.
Mhm.
I have options. Different inference.
Mhm.
So in a way, it makes reasoning, changing your reasoning look simple the way that I'm describing it.
Yeah.
But in a way, logically, it is that easy. So I'm down in the dumps. I don't want to do anything. I feel bored. Okay, so what can you do? Those are all inferences. So instead of those, what are some different inferences that could be made?
Right, right. And even though the way you said that one, you can see the slide from one thing to another. And I'll explain slide in a moment. How you say, okay, I'm in this relationship, but if I break off this relationship, it could be worse. Could be worse, and that's true. That's true. But then the slide is from it could be worse to something like it probably will be worse. And then there's another slide to say it will almost certainly be worse. And each of those slides is an additional inference. But I think those other two slides, those other two inferences are unconscious ones. That is, we just slip from the fact that it could be worse to it will be worse. And so I'm stuck here. I have no options. But it shows something about how the unconscious inferences and the conscious inferences interact with one another. Yeah.
And if we imagine an activity in which, let's say tomorrow, all day long, you, I, everyone who's with us, we do this homework. We just focus on our inferences. Now, of course, you're going to be living your life and doing whatever you're doing, but you are highlighting the inferences you're making. So, and the one way to do this is to know, for example, like if I go and I pick up a book and I sit down and read it, then I can say, what were my inferences before I did that? So in other words, you may not be aware at the moment, okay, my inference is I'm going to pick up the book now and I'm going to enjoy some reading. But that is what happens when before you pick up the book. Or you might say, I've got a little time now. You're saying that in your mind, in the privacy of your mind. So we want to make those inferences a little more explicit in our practice so that we can begin to see the inference making.
Right. And I would say I would add only that we want to be more conscious of the important inferences we're making, the inferences that have a large impact on our lives, have large implications for our lives, because since inferences are all over the place, if we spent our time just cataloging all the inferences we're making, we'd get lost in details.
Yes, but Gerald, remember, you're aware of your inferences. Most people are not aware of them.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're right. Eventually, we want to focus on our important inferences. But for now, I think we need to figure out what an inference is.
Right. I see what you mean. Right.
You see, and to do that, you've got to see yourself making an inference. So your child throws something across the room. You think something about the child. What do you think? It's fine because he's allowed to do that. He's enjoying himself. Or I've told him 500 times not to do that in the house.
Right.
See, you wanted to hear it. Like, what is the voice? What is the inference that you make? Your husband walks in the room. What do you think? What do you think? What is your inference?
Yeah, that's very nice. And it just goes to the heart of critical thinking in that it's got that reflective step in it. I mean, we're making inferences all the time. We're aware maybe here and there, but most of the time we're just completely unaware of them. And the critical thinking step is taking a step back and looking at my thinking and realizing, oh, okay, that was an inference. That was an inference. That was an inference. So I'm getting an insight into what an inference is and how they're operative in my life.
Exactly. So that after I've done this 100 times, then I become more aware of my inference making. And then I transition from that, let's hope, to focusing on the important inferences.
Mhm.
So, and by the way, I have never done this before, what we're talking about. It's something I've never thought of in exactly this way. So, but if you just, when it's like you're slowing down your life for a day.
Yeah.
And it's akin to practice in, let's say, any sport.
It
So
is.
when you do, right, when you're learning to play basketball, you're running certain drills.
Mhm.
Well, you may not run any of those exact drills in a game,
Mhm.
right? But
Mhm.
you hopefully are learning the skills so that when you do play the game, in other words, now it's significant that you get it right.
Right.
And that's the analogy, then you're able to. So what, and this relates to my belief that if we're not actively practicing critical thinking, then we're not going to advance very far as critical thinkers.
That's right. Yeah.
It's got to be something that we do literally, like someone who's at a professional level of sports, let's say tennis. If
Mhm.
you're at this professional level of tennis, how often do you think about tennis?
Mhm. 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 Mhm.
Well, reasoning has to take that place, that same place in terms of significance in human life.
Yeah. Right.
And these, what we could call micro steps, or these, slowing it down. Now, when you couldn't do this every day because it would be exhausting, but you're just trying to do it long enough so that now you're seeing, okay, he threw that ball, I inferred this, what's going on? Is this a good inference?
Mhm. Mhm.
So there is a lot in this. And then I just wanted to mention, you also said in your early statement, see, I've still got my notes in front of me, that in the test that you are referring to,
Mhm.
that where students are asked to make inferences.
Mhm.
So this shows ignorance on the part of the test makers,
Mhm.
because it shows that they don't understand what an inference is.
Mhm. Mhm.
They don't recognize that they're making inferences constantly. And you already basically said this, but I just wanted to
Mhm.
kind of
Right.
come on the backs of that and stress this even more. It's a common mistake in schooling. And anytime we're misusing these terms, then that's just taking us backwards in terms of critical thinking. We've already got problems advancing critical thinking enough. But when we add these confusions and these misunderstandings, then we've really got problems, and there is no excuse for it.
Mhm.
And so making an inference, we need to all understand we're continually making them.
Mhm.
The question is, are we making, as it were, good inferences? Or you could say reasonable inferences. Or you could say justifiable, all of these, again, being intellectual standards.
Mhm.
And you mentioned some other intellectual standards as well. So we are not asking people to make inferences. We are sick and tired of some of their inferences. And the same for our own selves, right? I mean, many of our inferences are just nonsensical, and they're getting us into trouble, and they're making us feel bad about ourselves and our lives. And we've got to make better inferences, but we don't, that doesn't mean you just change what you think in context. And so, okay, so somebody, let's say you live with someone who's actually not a nice person at all, and then you actually do have options to get out, but you tell yourself, oh, well, in the past, I've been making the inference that he's bothering me. Now I'm going to make the inference that he's not bothering me. Well, but if the person keeps bullying you and doing things to you that are harmful to you, you can't just make a different inference because you'd like to.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the standard there is realistic. I mean,
Yes.
that's one we haven't mentioned before, but there's this impression that I can change reality by thinking about it a different way. And sometimes that's, of course, true, but sometimes it's really not true.
Mhm. Mhm.
If I interpret the person as not being very mean, but he is very mean,
Mhm.
then I'm making an incorrect inference, right? And ruining my life in the process.
Now, if we're locked in a situation, let's say you're a hostage,
Mhm.
then making inferences like, I'm not going to let that bother me. I'm being treated this in a brutish way. I'm not going to let them get to me. That's when you would use that kind of thinking, if
Sure,
you
right,
can,
right.
depending on how horrible the circumstances are.
Mhm.
And all reasoning, let us be reminded that all reasoning occurs in context. And we're talking about generalizations here. We're making general moves. We're coming up with general principles, or we're discussing general principles that may not apply in a given extenuating circumstance.
Right.
So in a borderline case, or, then we may think very differently. So we don't want anyone to think that, oh, this is just very easy. And if this guy's mistreating me, then I can just, easily leave. Well, maybe I can't. Maybe I've got to work some things out before I do. Maybe I have to really figure out my best thinking before I do. Maybe I need to be careful even trying to leave this person. Maybe I'm in danger even trying to leave. So I need to think well as I can there, and think again realistically, as you mentioned.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If a police officer stops you and says that you went through a stop sign and you think you didn't, you might think that the officer made an unjustified inference through an unjustified conclusion. But that's a very different thing from saying to the officer, you've made an unjustified inference. That saying it doesn't follow. No, even if you come to the conclusion, because saying it in certain circumstances can be a dangerous thing to do.
So now that adds the behavioral, if you will, or the action component. So
Yeah.
we make inferences, and inference is happening in your mind, in the human mind.
Right.
And also in other animal minds,
Mhm.
but just sticking to humans. So we're making inferences. But just because you make an inference, like let's say he's being unfair to me right now. Let's say that's the inference.
Right.
And maybe it's true, but that doesn't mean that I should behave in accordance with that
Indeed.
way of thinking. So it's then we have to make another move, which is, yes, but what do I do right now?
Right. Another inference, another set of inferences.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a way in which I think making a move, the phrase we both use, but you use a lot. Making a move, move in reasoning. I'm thinking those may always be inferences. What making a move is, maybe not. I'm making overgeneralizing it.
Well, I think every time you do, there is inference making that's occurring in that.
Right.
Because even if you say, well, let's see, what is our purpose right now? Well, our purpose is X. Well, did you infer that our purpose was X?
Yeah, yeah.
Sort of like concepts. You can always push that one in, because every element is a concept.
Right, right.
So this makes it a little confusing at times, but I do think that if we had command of all of these processes, we would all reason at a higher level of quality. And because we're making inferences continually, therefore quickly. So, for example, if I'm listening to you talk for 20 minutes, then how many inferences do I have to make during that 20 minutes?
Yeah, countless probably.
Right, because every time you say something, I have to make sense of it, every single time. And therefore, of course, I'm going to miss some of what was said. And therefore, I'm looking for the highlights. You see, these are all inferences. And therefore, again, they're so pervasive that it's hard to target them. Like, let's say you're standing in the kitchen, let's say you're washing the dishes, and your mind is kind of wandering on this and that and the other thing. And then you realize, then you can go into that and say, well, what are you really thinking about right now, Linda? Like, well, what is the quality of your thinking right now? Are you relaxing your mind? Are you worrying about something? Are you whatever people do? Are you, or the person may say, maybe becoming very irritated because of something that someone else said to them earlier. They may be standing there feeling resentment because of the way they're treated. So what is going on in the privacy of your mind? It gets at that as well. What are you, your mind is going from this to that, to this, to that, to this, to that. These are not necessarily all inferences, because you may be just kind of daydreaming, so to speak.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about inferences and information and assumptions and the differences between them or among them. Someone asked me recently in a webinar, a teacher who said, how can I convey the difference between assumptions and inferences or conclusions to my students, the difference between assumptions and conclusions to my students? And I said, well, just my analogy, my illustration. So, well, the conclusion is like you're driving home and your conclusion is home, and your assumptions are the streets you use to get home. So that's my rough analogy for how an assumption works. And it's an all right illustration, I think, but it leaves something out, and I don't have an answer to this one. I think maybe if I dwelt on it, I could, but same thing could be said for information. That is, information can be the streets I use to drive home. Assumptions can be the streets I use to drive home, where home is the conclusion. And I don't have a good illustration for the difference between assumption and information. I don't have a nice analogy that captures that difference, but maybe someone who's listening can email.
Well, it's interesting that your training in traditional philosophy, which mixes together information and assumption as premises,
right,
may be part of the analogy here. But the way that I think about the relationship between the three, inferences, information and assumptions, is more in terms of a visual image. So we have information that could be a situation that we're faced with, could be something we're reading, can be something that somebody just said, can be some data we're looking at, it could be our experiences, and so forth. There can be other ways of delineate information. And so we're looking at a situation, I'm looking at a situation, for example, and from that situation, I make an inference. And that inference comes through my assumption base.
okay,
And the assumption, or it could be a set of assumptions, depending on how complicated the situation is. But let's just say an assumption leads me to the inference, taking into account the information. In other words, the information is seen through the assumption. And it is really the assumption that drives the way we interpret the information. And therefore, the assumption lies as an assumption, it lies at the unconscious level of thought. And of course, we'll get into assumptions in another podcast, but it's at the unconscious level. But we don't just see like I see a light next door in the middle of the night. Well, I have to make some sense of that light if I'm trying to make sense of it. How do I make sense of it? Well, I make sense of it based on what I assume about situations like this, what I assume about a light itself. So you assume that if you see something like this in the middle of the night, something is unusual at minimum. But maybe not. Maybe you just haven't been down in the middle of the night, and actually somebody that lives next door has insomnia, and they come down at the same time as it's like 2 in the morning, and you see, you've only seen it once. but you assume that your assumptions sort of they give you the terrain from which to draw your conclusion. So you have some knowledge, prior knowledge, that's another way of thinking of it, of lights in this situation. And these assumptions, because they are taken for granted, they're lying at the unconscious level, and they are difficult to figure out. They're more difficult, let's say, than the information. So let me give an example, if I could.
Yeah, do that.
So this is from, by the way, our book entitled Critical Thinking: Tools for Taking Charge of Your Professional and Personal Life. If you're wanting to learn critical thinking, those of you who are joining us, this is a good book to learn from in terms of the overall conception. And so this, I'm looking at the chapter 6 on the parts of thinking, page 113. And here are some examples of where we can distinguish between information, inference, and assumptions. What would you infer in this instant, in these instances, if it were 12 noon? So you might infer it's time for lunch.
Oh,
okay, something simple like that. So if it's 12 noon, okay, so I'm looking at the clock, it's 12 noon. That's the information. From this, I infer, in this case, it's time for lunch. Why would I infer that? Because I always have lunch at 12 noon. And that's an assumption. Lunch happens at 12 noon.
right. And so let me go back to the classic conception of logic or of reasoning, and the account that they offer. This is one conception of how an assumption works. That is, an assumption is kind of a bridge that takes you to the conclusion from wherever you start. So you start with it's noon, and the bridge and the conclusion you're drawing is it's time to eat. And the bridge, the assumption is I always eat at noon, or noon is the time we should eat. And that's one of the conceptions of an assumption, that it's a kind of a bridge that takes you to your conclusion.
Yes.
But it's not the only concept of an assumption, because because I could say, well, I assume it's about noon, and I also assume that I eat at noon, around noon, so I should draw the conclusion. Both of those could be assumptions, and I could draw the conclusion from it. That is, I don't look at my watch. I just feel, I think it's around noon, so it's an assumption. It's not information. And
it seems like that's an inference.
Well, they're all inferences, I'd say. I mean,
well, it depends on how it's being used in the reasoning. So if you're taking it for granted, meaning that you're not questioning it,
right,
and you're not even really probably aware of it,
right,
and it's functioning as that bridge that you mentioned, which I think is a good analogy, by the way, right, then it is serving as an assumption. So the information you said, you said something like, I think it's about 12 noon.
I think it's about noon. Yeah, it just feels like noon.
That's an inference. And from that, you basically so yeah, I mean, that's my reading. And then I always eat at 12 noon, because let's say you think, well, it's probably 12 noon, and you start walking to the kitchen or wherever you eat. Then the assumption is I always eat at this time. And somehow you've decided that it is 12 noon. So it's a similar situation as far as I can tell. But let's go to another one.
Okay.
There are black clouds in the sky. And that's the information.
Okay.
it's probably going to rain.
Right.
Inference.
Right.
Assumption. Whenever there are clouds in the sky that look like that, it's probably going to rain.
Right. Right.
Now, this happened yesterday. This shows you how the opposite can work. Very trivial example, maybe not for those of us who live in California. So last night, kind of, late in the evening, it looked like it was misting. It was a little water out. And, we have, it's not our rainy season and we're not supposed to be getting water right now. And we don't get rain we don't get rain this time of year.
Mhm.
That's the assumption.
Mhm.
But it actually did slightly rain like all night long. And that all of the people that were around were surprised because it's not supposed to rain right now. You see, that's our assumption, but it did. So some people, didn't bring in their furniture or whatever because they assumed it can't rain this time of year.
Right. Right.
So we're continually making these inferences and these based on assumptions, and they can be rather trivial, but they may not be trivial.
Right. As you delve in, it's difficult to keep things from becoming too complicated. And inference is a good way to make things complicated because there's a sense in which, and you said this earlier, there's a sense in which everything is an inference. Like when you say there are black clouds in the sky, that's a piece of information, but it's also an inference that you draw from what you've just seen, like your flashlight example. You see the light, you think it's a flashlight. So when I gather information and I interpret it a certain way, there are black clouds in the sky, then I'm drawing a conclusion, but that conclusion is a piece of information. I'm hoping I'm not going to make it too complicated. And something of similar is true with assumptions. That is, there's a way in which, I mean, this, and you said this just a little while ago. We have the 8 elements, but you can take any one of those elements and analyze it in terms of the other 7, right? So I can analyze information in terms of what assumptions do I make when I say there's a black cloud in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that my vision is working well, that there are no odd characteristics of the sky, no meteorological anomalies that I know of. So I'm making assumptions, and I'm drawing a conclusion that there are black clouds in the sky, and that functions as information. I'm making it too complicated.
Yeah, no, that is too complicated. And the way to the usefulness here for me is, so if let's say you're planning anything, you're planning to get a different car, you're planning to get a different house, anything that's requiring, it's a significant issue in your life. You're going to, let's just take a car, for example. You need to get a different car. And yours is, kaput. And so to make a good decision on that, to make the best decision in this case, you're going to have to make some very good inferences.
Right.
And you're going to have certain kinds of information.
Indeed.
You had better know the difference between the information, as in the facts,
right,
versus your reading of the facts.
Right. And the assumptions you're making that take you from one to the other.
Exactly.
Right.
And if you use the elements of reasoning in this way, then they're very powerful. Because you can say, let's say this is actually a good example for doing the full logic of the problem, because it's an important issue for you. The stakes are relatively high for you financially, let's just say, and in terms of hassle and headache. And so it makes sense to really put your mind into this. So you might write out the full logic. What is my purpose? What am I really trying? What am I trying to accomplish here? what information, what is my key question? Well, I know that. What car should I purchase or lease or whatever the case may be? Now, what information do I need to use to answer this? So what, and then you would have to say, well, okay, I'm concerned about safety. I'm concerned about the cost, concerned about whether it's a electric vehicle or gas. So this is all in the information, begins in the information category. And then once I have all that information that I think is relevant to the question, and hopefully I've gathered all the significant information relevant to the question, then I've got to interpret that information.
Right.
And finally make a decision. In the end, the final move will be a decision. In that process, I'll also uncover assumptions I'm making. And I may not need to write out all of this because when I'm writing out my purpose, I can see some of my assumptions.
Sure.
But it's still essential for us to be able to pull apart the elements and understand these elements and not overwork the piece, so to speak, overwork it and make it too complicated. So then it's no longer useful.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Gerald, I think that we should close there. I think that it's a very exciting thing to talk about ideas and to explore these elements of reasoning at deeper levels.
Yes.
And I always enjoy our discussions.
Me too.
Because I feel that we actually do communicate.
Yeah. And one thing I like is that your examples tend to be real life kind of action oriented examples, decision making examples, and real life ones that people actually face. So it's very different from the philosophical background that I come from.
Well, we've got more theory to work through, and we need more people doing this with us.
Mm-hmm.
We need more serious scholars of the theory of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to continue to expand in many directions, which is what we're trying to do, you and I together.
Mm-hmm.
We need more people in this with us.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I will close. Thank you, Gerald.
Thank you, Linda. Enjoyable talking with you and just talking about inferences in general. Yeah.
And yes, and thank you to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Good night.